Good to see some faces I haven't seen for a while. I was going to say old faces, but I'm getting that way a bit too. Glenna, Bill, good to see you guys. I want to talk this morning about the Hebrews passage, and often I talk about the gospel readings, but I want to sort of not focus on that today and focus on Hebrews 11. Smithy would sometimes talk over the years about having a reasonable faith, which is a faith that's not blind, but based on evidence. I think that's useful, which, while I don't think classic apologetics that many of us may have grown up with grabs a lot of people these days. At the same time, it's useful in stabilising a sense of knowing what we believe and why we believe it and what difference that makes to our lives. One of the reasons I remain a believer after 40 years is because of my belief in the story of Jesus and my belief that the stuff that we read in the Gospels, his life, death, and resurrection, actually is history, actually happened. I still believe that. I'm still convinced by that, and it still makes a difference in my life, in my journey over these years. One of my maybe a hero of the faith in a sense is N.T. Wright, a New Testament theologian from the UK. Written heaps of books about the historical Jesus and who Jesus was and about the context of the time in which he and the early church lived. And he says that the best explanation for the explosive growth in the church in the first century is because that stuff actually happened. I mean, there's all different sorts of explanations. People over 2,000 years have given different reasons for the growth of the church and what happened. But he's done meticulous research. One of his books is called The Resurrection of the Son of God. It's part of a three-book series, about 800 or 900 pages. He says once that his dad reviewed the book for him and said it got interesting at about page 700. But in that book, it's not the classic apologetics either, but it does include that. But he looks at the context in which Jesus lived, the context of the whole thing of expecting a Jewish Messiah in that time, the whole thing of what the early church did, how they grew, how they formed, what they believed, how they lived their lives. And he comes to the same conclusion, that ultimately something happened back then, 2,000 years ago, that turned their world and the Roman world completely inside out and upside down. A small group of scared, humiliated believers cowering in an upstairs room after Jesus died were turned into people who literally gave their lives because they were utterly convinced that this Jesus they followed physically rose from death. When I used to work at World Vision years ago, I was fortunate enough to look at the work of Tom Wright in some detail, and also felt fortunate to work with people like Tim Costello, who also said that if you look at theologically, belief in the physical resurrection of Jesus follows and it makes sense in terms of how we live our lives in the here and now. Because it talks about the eventual coming together of heaven and earth, and about how the Christian hope is not about going to heaven when we die up in the sky someday. It's about heaven coming here and the renewal of this world. And so what that means is that everything in existence has to have Jesus at the centre, if Jesus is who he says he is. Christians often talk about Jesus being Lord of all. But really what most Christians mean about that is Lord of our personal lives. But if we really believe that Jesus is Lord of all, then he has to be Lord of not just our personal lives, but of everything in existence. Jared McKenna says that if Jesus is not Lord of all, he is not Lord at all. If he is not Lord of all, he's not Lord at all. So that means everything, our own personal lives, our politics, economics, sexuality, care for the world, care for the poor, all those things are central gospel issues, none more important or less important than anything else. And that's why working for that stuff, as this church and movement has done for so many years, Steps and other movements out of this, God Squad as well, are all central gospel things that they do, that we've done over so many years. So this idea that evangelicals often have of separating evangelism and social action is not a Christian position. When we do works of evangelism or justice, we don't do it because they're a nice thing to do. We do it because it's part of the gospel. We do it because we are Christian, not in spite of it. We do it because we are Christian. And looking at this passage from Hebrews today, talking about heroes of the faith, and I love your testimony, Lorraine, too. I always love personal stories like that, just how the Spirit's at work in a life, and there's probably heroes in your life you can look back on and people who have influenced you. So thank you for giving that. It's really powerful. If our faith, I think, doesn't make us more like Jesus ultimately, doesn't make us more loving, more whole human beings, then it's not the faith of Jesus. The Jesus who said, as Colin pointed out before, loving God, loving our neighbour, which Jesus says covers everything. Do unto others as you would want those to do unto you. The whole law and the prophets, everything is covered by that, Jesus said. It's a process too, though. It's a journey. People in 12-step circles often talk about progress, not perfection. Richard Rohr, the Franciscan priest from the US, says that we grow not by getting things right, but by getting it wrong. We grow not by getting it right, but by getting it wrong. It's a great line in one of I think it's one of the most recent Star Wars movies, where Yoda says in his own way, "Failure, your greatest teacher is." I love that. It's always stuck with me. So it's about learning from when we get it wrong, not if, but when we get it wrong, and knowing it's okay to get it wrong. It's okay to fail. And it's okay to be in a church where we fail and forgive and move forward in relationship. When I worked at Anglican Overseas Aid some years ago, I used to speak at churches about the work that organisation does. A bit like World Vision, but probably literally 100 times smaller. And one of the things I would say at the end of a homily I would give at those churches was a quote from St. Irenaeus, who lived in the 2nd century, who said that the glory of God is a human being fully alive. The glory of God is a human being fully alive. And living a life of faith is about that, is about living a full life, a life of abundance, as Jesus called it. Going back to Tim Costello, he would often say that salvation is the liberation of the human spirit to love. It's growth. Sin is the degradation, or putting down of the human spirit to love, whereas salvation is the liberation to love. When I was overseas recently, I read a book by a guy called David Benner called Surrender to Love. I recommend that to anyone. It's just a small, probably a couple of 100 pages. And he talks about surrendering to love with a capital L, surrendering to God. And he talks about becoming love. Not about just actions about doing, although it includes that, but it's about being, about becoming love, surrendering to love, knowing that we are loved ourselves. Again, looking at heroes of the faith, I was moved again, as I often am, by people like Martin Luther King, a hero of the faith. And he often talked about the difference between faith and fear. He would mention an old Irish proverb which says, "Fear knocked at the door, faith answered, there was no one there." Fear knocked at the door, faith answered, there was no one there. Dr. King, of course, displayed incredible faith himself, outrageous faith against all sorts of hardship, which eventually took his own life. And if you've seen his mountaintop speech given the night before he was killed, He said, very similarly to what we heard in Hebrews 11 today, that one day his people would reach the promised land, that he might not get there with them, but one day his people would reach the promised land. And he showed incredible conviction in what he was doing, that he could even say, if we were wrong, God Almighty is wrong, because he had such conviction about what he was doing, the movement he was leading. That might come across as arrogant to some, but it displayed incredible faith in my view, because he was speaking in the mould of the Old Testament prophets who railed against the injustice of Israel and called for them to repent and turn back to God, to care for those who are suffering. Same mould as them, John the Baptist, Jesus himself, of course, too. So if we're going to talk about faith, it's always got to be about living a life of love. Earlier in the week, I was having a conversation with some colleagues about faith, and it just got me thinking about something that Kath McKinney set up up here many years ago, about the fact that she said that the opposite of faith is not doubt, but the opposite of faith is certainty. Now, when she said that, this is probably 20 years ago, I didn't really get it, but I do now. It's because certainty can be a problem, because it can lead to a sort of arrogance, the attitude that I'm right, you're wrong, and if you don't believe like I do, woe to you. Doesn't make for very healthy relating, doesn't make for openness for relationship. Turns people away from Jesus. Jesus didn't operate like that. It's not attractive. It often is arrogance dressed up as evangelistic fervour. The great thing about the Jewish faith is that they leave room for open, healthy debate, vigorous debate, where they can talk and debate for hours about certain things. And if you look at the Torah, the Old Testament, the first 5 books of the Old Testament, the overarching emphasis in that is not about getting beliefs right, getting a doctrine right. It's about living. It's about the ethical demands, caring for the widow and the stranger in the land. Over and over again, there are those commands. And why does God emphasise that so strongly in that? Because he says, because you were strangers in the land yourselves. So have empathy, have compassion. Put yourselves in their shoes, like because you were that one time. So you show that to others. Don't have a situation where the oppressed becomes the oppressor. Put yourselves in the shoes of the other. And I think it's the whole point of the incarnation. Jesus coming to earth, God coming to earth in the form of Jesus, coming into the pain and struggle of this life, this world, to live so we can relate. He can resonate, and we know that he gets it. When you speak to someone, and I was talking to Amy before about this, that you can talk to a counsellor and it's great, but when you speak to someone who knows what you're going through, it's different because they get it. It's not just sympathy, it's empathy. They know what you're talking about, and you feel heard, you feel seen, you feel listened to, because they know. Some of the men's stuff that I work in, we often just let ourselves be heard. We don't try to fix each other. We sit around a fire, talk about our stuff, and no one bats an eyelid. We just say, I hear you, brother. And there's nothing better than that. It's gold. When you're just heard and someone gets it without trying to fix you. So the incarnation shows that God is a God who suffers with us. That's why Jesus was referred to in Isaiah as a man of sorrows, familiar with grief. We're all familiar with grief. We've all been through stuff. It's a rare person who hasn't been through it. remember years ago, about 10 years ago, when I was going through my divorce, that I was speaking to a group of mainly young people at a church, and I said to them, you know, if you haven't been through intense suffering in your life yet, you will. And we all do. It's a rare person who doesn't go through that. So a proper Christ-like, reasonable faith, the one that the people that we read about in Hebrews 11, is one that breeds compassion for others. If it doesn't, if our faith doesn't breed compassion for others, it's not the faith of Jesus. It's a million miles from him. And I think too many churches have an emphasis only on right belief. Belief matters, don't get me wrong on that. But many theological colleges require you to sign on to a statement of faith which the devil himself could sign, because they say nothing about how to live your life. So it's like if you believe these things, if you give intellectual assent to it, then you're in. Then you're a real Christian. But Jesus doesn't operate like that. And one of the things I thought about this week is, if you look at Jesus' disciples, here's a question for you. It's a rhetorical question, you don't have to answer it. Were Jesus' disciples Christians? If you look at what a lot of churches go by what Christian is, they failed miserably in that area. They believed all the wrong things about who Jesus was. They constantly got it wrong. Jesus even referred to Peter as Satan. You know, ouch, it's pretty harsh. So they got it all wrong. And you know, if you read the Gospels, do you know the ones who did get it right about who Jesus was? This one you can answer if you want. Who were the ones who constantly got it right in the Gospels about who Jesus is? Paul, yep. Who else? Sorry? Prostitutes, yep. Herod. How about demons? Every time the demons got it right about who Jesus is. There's also the Roman centurion at the cross who said, surely this was the Son of God. But the disciples, his closest followers, they weren't Christians according to what many churches say. They were with him for 3 years. But how did Jesus treat them? Did he say, go and get your doctrine sorted out first, then come and follow me? He just said, no, follow me. Come as you are. Now again, I'm not saying doctrine doesn't matter, it does. Bad theology can literally cost lives. Okay, so I want to make that pretty clear. Because when it's all about, for example, if you just focus on only evangelism and you neglect justice stuff, then you'll let people physically die before because you want to evangelise. So I'm not saying that doctrine doesn't matter. It does. But Jesus allowed his disciples to journey with him over 3 years of his ministry, with all their wrong ideas, with all their doubts. I remember someone said years ago about what we call the Great Commission, which I've also heard called the Great Omission in a lot of ways. After Jesus' resurrection, when he tells the disciples to go out into all the world, make disciples, teaching them to follow all I've taught. You know, in Matthew's Gospel, when Jesus says that, it says that the remaining 11, because Judas had died by this stage, went to where Jesus had told them to go, and they worshipped him. But then it says, but some doubted. Now, why would Matthew put that in? He specifically says, some doubted. But Jesus, again, didn't say, deal with your doubts first, and then come back, and then I'll get you to go out and, do my stuff. He just says, go out and make disciples with your doubts, with your confusion, just as you are. Just as you are. And when you see the life of the early church, They had their own arguments. In the book of Acts, you see, great debates about should the new believers who weren't Jews become like Jews and so on, get circumcised, all that sort of stuff. Most of Paul's letters address schisms in the early church. But despite that, the legacy of the early church, especially the first 300 years or so, where their guiding framework was the Sermon on the Mount, their legacy was one where they turned the world upside down. Completely turned it upside down. Through love of neighbour. I mentioned last time I was here, if you read a book by Rodney Stark called The Rise of Christianity, where he talks about the main reason for the explosive growth in the early church was because of their care for abandoned people, which no one else would take in. For example, if you were a girl born in that time, often you were literally abandoned on a rubbish heap because you were a girl. Christians took them in and brought them up. That's really often how the church grew. The Holy Spirit had a pretty big part to play as well, but that's all linked. They did it through their love of Jesus, lived out in love of neighbour, love of enemy, taking in those who were rejected on the edges of society. So if you doubt, if you're not sure about your theology, about what you believe, you're in pretty good company. The disciples were like that. We talk about doubting Thomas. He wasn't the only one who doubted. They all doubted, really. Peter, denied Jesus 3 times in the hour of Jesus' greatest need. But Jesus reinstated him. After his resurrection, said 3 times, "Do you love me?" Not because he was so insecure or needed to hear it 3 times, but because he was reinstating Peter. Because he believed in Peter. He said, "You can do this. I know your heart. You can do this." So healthy faith. Faith is healthiest not without doubt, but in spite of it. Faith is healthiest not without doubt, but in spite of it. Healthy faith leaves room for doubt, leaves room for questions. I mentioned a book some time ago as well. We often talk about Jesus is the answer. The great book I saw called Jesus is the Question. Because if you look at the Gospels, they found that there was 307 questions that Jesus was asked in all 4 Gospels. He answered only a handful of them. He would often respond to questions with a question himself. He wasn't that interested in answers. So a healthy church is one where honest questions are welcomed, not shunned, where you feel safe. You're still accepted if you don't happen to believe the right things. In a lot of churches, people talk about the 3 B's, the B words, and often in this order: belief, behaviour, and belonging. The idea is that if you get your beliefs right, your behaviour will follow, and then you can belong. Again, it's not what I see in the way of Jesus in the Gospels. I think belonging is paramount. I think it's the greatest human need, to belong. We need to belong, to have our tribe. That's why we have so much to learn from Indigenous people in this country, about belonging to the land, to each other. Johann Hari, the British researcher, talks about tribes and how we're the first society in human history to actively dismantle our tribes, where we normalise individualism, being on our own. Yet in a country like Australia, we have anxiety, depression, which is off the charts, loneliness, all sorts of mental health issues. The early church emphasised belonging as paramount. In Acts 2, Acts 4, it says they shared everything in common. They sold all their possessions. They lived in common in community. No one was in need. If you look at communities like the Bruderhof who have communities all around the world who live according to the Sermon on the Mount. They live by a common purse as well. And you'll find that their rates of loneliness, mental health, mental illness are much lower than in the rest of society, because people have a sense of belonging. They know they fit, and they know they're going to be looked after. They live in community. Because having a sense, this is something that John used to often talk about as well, about being part of something bigger than yourself. We often say too that a person wrapped up in themselves is a pretty small package. So belonging is the greatest need. So doctrine matters, but living a Christ-like life matters more. I'm always challenged by the parable of the Good Samaritan. I think it's just so profound. I think it's been so domesticated often as a nice little story about caring for your neighbour, which it is that too. But why does Jesus make a Samaritan the hero of the story, of all people? Because he was telling his story to a Jewish lawyer, and Jews and Samaritans absolutely despised each other. He says that a priest and a Levite, two respected Jewish leaders, actively walked away from the man in need who was beaten up and lying on the ground. But the Samaritan, who believed all the wrong things, who wasn't one of the in people, wasn't seen as a real person of God, he's the one who showed compassion. And Jesus said, go and be like him. So you imagine today, you might have an evangelical and a respected Christian Bible lecturer walking on the other side of the road, actively walking away from the person in need. But a staunch Muslim comes along, treats the beaten man with dignity, takes him to the local hotel, puts him up for the night, goes out of his way, and Jesus says, go and be like that Muslim. As you hear that, how do you feel? Are you squirming? Do you feel uncomfortable? If you do, embrace that, because that's the way of Jesus. I heard it said once that everywhere Jesus went, he caused a crisis. He's done that in my life a few times. And so let's embrace discomfort. Let ourselves be challenged by Jesus, who shows compassion over having all your beliefs set in a straight line. St. Paul talks about the most important thing in his letter to the Galatians. He says the most important thing is faith lived out in love. Faith lived out in love is what St. Paul says is the most important thing. And sometimes we can't see the next step in front of us. That's where it's walking by faith and not by sight, another thing that Paul said. So we move forward in love. And if we're not sure what to do in a situation, we ask God. We move forward in love. Love God and love your neighbour. Because that's what God wants for our lives, I think. And that's what real faith